research material they needed to understand the human body at a deep level in the form of Jewish people and others whom the Nazi state didn't consider fully human. During World War II, Nazi scientists such as Joseph Mengele performed experiments on humans in concentration camps. Among other atrocities, Mengele conducted studies of genetics, including twin studies, but killed subjects afterwards, sending tissue samples back to Berlin for further analysis. Like the Allies, the Nazis developed drugs, but the Nazis weren't sure if they should focus on antibiotics, which kill bacteria, or on homeopathic remedies, which are based on the idea that a substance that causes a disease in a healthy person can cure similar symptoms in a sick person. To conduct their tests, the Nazis simulated brutal war injuries on concentration camp prisoners and then tried to prevent infections using different agents. Finally, the Nazis developed a robust euthanasia program, or way of testing the cheapest, fastest ways to kill the most people without causing them to riot. Meanwhile, in occupied China, an infamous group of biologists and chemists within the Imperial Japanese Army called Unit 731 carried out some similarly horrifying research. They cut patients open while they were still alive without anesthesia, they tested new biological weapons, they tested the limits of human resistance to hypothermia or frostbite. It gets worse, but you get the idea. When the war ended, the United States government discovered the atrocities committed by the Imperial Japanese doctors, and they cut a deal. The US would grant certain war criminals immunity in exchange for their data. So where's the goodness that I talked about at the beginning of the episode? Well, after World War II, more drugs, medical technologies, and novel procedures emerged. For example, in the 1950s, Jonas Salk and A.B. Sabin created the polio vaccine, which was very good. But the deeper point is that medicine, now a global institution, had a long look at itself. The vast majority of doctors and government officials were absolutely sickened by the revelations of the doctors' trial of the Nazis. Doctors convened and created a new way of handling medical research with human subjects, the Nuremberg Code of Medical Ethics. In fact, a whole new branch of philosophy was born, bioethics. On the policy side, all human subjects research in the US now has to be approved by institutional review boards, or IRBs. It's a long process in which scientists and regulators scrutinize what will or won't be done in the name of medicine, to whom or for what purpose. And it's one of the greatest, quietest moral wins in the history of science. Next time, we finally bring together Darwin and Mendel in an intellectual supergroup called the Modern Synthesis. Don't miss it. Crash Course History of Science is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney studio in Missoula, Montana, and it's made with the help of all of these nice people, and our animation team is Thought Cafe. Crash Course is a Complexly production. If you want to keep imagining the world complexly with us, you can check out some of our other channels like SciShow, Nature League, and The Financial Diet. And if you'd like to help keep Crash Course free for everybody forever, you can support the series at Patreon, a crowdfunding platform that allows you to support the content you love. Thank you to all of our patrons for making Crash Course possible with their continued support. By the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, physics had been revolutionized. Again, much as Newton had done in 1666, Einstein did in 1905. But once again, biology was late to the paradigm-shifting party. Remember how Darwin and Mendel lived around the same time, but everyone forgot about Mendel until 1900? And even then, biologists saw Darwinism and Mendelism as two competing grand theories about how life works? The Darwin and Wallace people thought traits blended, and they studied big populations of different species in the wild and in fossils, while the Mendelians studied roses or flies in labs, and they saw that some traits aren't blended, but jump around according to Mendel's laws. And meanwhile, the eugenicists studied variation in human populations for creepy reasons. Well, it's time to bring these threads together into a new paradigm for biology, one that accounts for change over time in species through exacting quantitative analysis on different real-world populations. Medicine changed a lot after 1900 due to the discovery of different therapies like antibiotics. Likewise, biology changed a lot as scientists combined different ideas from natural selection to statistics in new ways. The result is a framework called the modern synthesis, or neo-Darwinism, and even today biologists mostly work within it. Basically, the modern synthesis uses Mendelian inheritance, Mendel's rules, to explain how Darwinian natural selection works in real time. So Darwin and Wallace's big ideas about change over long epochs across vast continents provided a solid theory for different researchers to use when designing studies in quantitative and population genetics, and when trying to make sense of their results. What did the modern synthesis look like as it happened? From 1928 to 1942, different people applied one theory across a bunch of forms of empirical science, gluing them together, hence synthesis. They also published influential books that knit together Darwinism with Mendelism, such as English ecological geneticist E.B. Ford's 1931 classic, Mendelism and Evolution. Now, there were too many modern synthesizers to shout out in one episode, but you've met a couple of them before. American geneticist and embryologist Thomas Hunt Morgan, for example, directed The Fly Room at Columbia from 1911 to 1928, which we visited in episode 25. Morgan trained a lot of biologists who contributed to the modern synthesis by exploring where genes are physically located on the chromosomes of fruit flies, members of the species Drosophila melanogaster. The flyboys also created databases of different alleles or versions of a gene. For example, they figured out that the dominant allele controlling the color of a fly's eyes makes it red, but recessive alleles exist for brown or white eyes. In fact, the fly room scientists could inbreed flies with specific traits until these mutants were pretty much new species. But this didn't prove how species were created in the wild. Maybe using artificial selection, the scientists were doing something that Darwin and Wallace's proposed mechanism, natural selection, didn't do, or did in a different way. One of Morgan's students, Ukrainian-American geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky, resolved this frustration by studying flies similar to the lab's Drosophila. Traveling from Canada to Mexico, Dobzhansky demonstrated that natural groups of flies have the same levels of genetic variation as mutants in labs. In fact, Dobzhansky showed that in the wild, variations are inherited pretty much as Darwin would have predicted, and most mutations aren't good or bad, which is why variation is so high. He joined the world's laboratory of genetics, the realm of experimentation, and field naturalism, the realm of observation. Dobzhansky published his landmark book Genetics and the Origin of Species in 1937, which established evolutionary genetics as a discipline. In his book, Dobzhansky defined evolution as the change in the frequency of an allele within a gene pool, which is pretty much how we teach it today. Darwin's natural selection, a culling of certain alleles from a population and allowing others to reproduce, is one of the main drivers of the evolution of species, along with completely random mutation and some other forces called gene flow and gene drift. Dobzhansky also spent much of his career trying to convince people not to think of humans like inbred mutant flies. Human races are not genetically defined but socially constructed. The biological features that people have associated with different races have changed over time, and the boundaries between those races have been redrawn. Dobzhansky was one of the many scientists who hoped that people would read about human genetics and suddenly change their view on human difference. Theo gave that a good try. Turns out we need more than just science. Dobzhansky was not the only biologist to turn to statistics as a tool for describing variation in living things. Starting around 1918, English statistician Ronald A. Fisher made numerous contributions to statistics and genetics, culminating in his banger, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection in 1930. He showed statistically that what looks like continuous natural selection is actually the result of combined changes to many different genes. Fisher's work provided much of the foundation for biostatistics, or how to apply statistics to biology, including using statistical concepts to understand the results of experiments. Unfortunately, Fisher was also a massive eugenicist who insisted that racial differences in humans mattered scientifically, so sort of the opposite of Dobzhansky. English scientist, socialist organizer, and consummate dapper dresser J.B.S. Haldane also helped pioneer biostatistics and a bunch of other stuff. In a 1915 paper, Haldane published the first genetic linkage maps for mammals, showing the order and relative distances of genes in guinea pigs and mice, and later chickens. This was a big step, moving from flies to mice. Haldane's work, like his 1932 book The Causes of Evolution, helped establish, with Fisher and American geneticist Sewall Wright, population genetics. This is the study of how genes vary in populations, including models of how different alleles will change in a population over time. Other scientists focused not on gene-by-gene change, but on a whole species. German ornithologist Ernst Mayr came up with the modern biological definition of a species, not just a bunch of similar organisms, but a group that can only breed with each other. Mayr published Systematics in the Origin of Species from the Viewpoint of a Zoologist in 1942, helping establish evolutionary biology as distinct from genetics and the other life sciences. Finally, British evolutionary biologist and eugenicist Julian Huxley published Evolution, the Modern Synthesis in 1942. This one was kind of the capstone of the whole modern synthesis. It summarized the research uniting evolution and genetics up to World War II. And Julian Huxley coined many terms still used by evolutionary biologists, such as Klein or the gradient of some.
Well, I may have gotten my run back. Hopefully. If I did everything right, and my calculations are right, then this should be a sub 12. Maybe. Who knows? So, hopefully, because it's 2:30 in the morning and I want to go to bed. Yeah, I was gonna go to bed at 2:30, and I started this run at like 2:59. So hopefully this is over now. If I'm not recording, I'm gonna be okay. I'm recording. Okay. So hopefully this is it, and I can go to bed, which would be great. Knowing me, I'll probably miss the jump up there and mess everything up, but we'll see what happens in the next minute, because I don't know whose idea it was to put a minute 43-second thing at the end of this, but it's here. There we go, 11:57. That's great.